May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please sit. Jesus is not just out for a quiet walk when he runs across this blind man begging in the street. Our very long gospel reading this morning is full of conflict. It's full of people asking questions, of people doubting, of people second-guessing, of people not believing, of people trying to make a point and others not getting the point. Some days it's much easier to picture Jesus in our world than others. And I think this is one of those lessons where our world encroaches so much into the story. All we have to do is turn on a 24-hour news channel to hear people questioning, second-guessing, arguing, believing and doubting. And this is the world that we are led into in today's lesson. Of course, the big theme here is light versus darkness, of being blind versus seeing. Jesus could have made his point any number of ways, including just walking past the blind man and waving his hand at him saying, "You're okay now." And he could have kept going, and the blind man would have been able to see, and the story would have continued. But we are in the middle of this conflict. And the conflict has started before today's reading. In fact, just before we hear the words, "as he walked," Jesus has been teaching in the synagogue, in the temple in Jerusalem. And he has managed to get all of the temple authorities very, very mad at him, and they want to get rid of him. And they've picked up stones and are ready to stone Jesus. And then John the evangelist tells us that Jesus just kind of disappeared into the crowd. And the very next thing we read is he's walking down the street towards the blind man. So this was no quiet walk in the street. And we also have to remember that Jesus is never traveling alone. Jesus is surrounded by his disciples, of course, but he's also surrounded by a crowd of other people. There are the people that he has healed and taught, have seen the light, who have seen who Jesus is, and just want to follow along. There's the people who are curious. Who is this guy? And what is he doing? And then there are all the people who are mad at him because he is disrupting the status quo. He is disrupting all the power structures around him. And so nothing Jesus does is happenstance. It's not random. He doesn't just walk by and say, "You are healed." He could have done that. He stops and makes a point, very publicly, to people who are appreciating what he's about to do and people who think this is just an awful lot of hocus pocus. And he makes mud with his saliva, a very strange act to witness, if you can imagine being there. And then he spreads that icky stuff all over the eyes of the blind man and instructs him to do something after that. It almost becomes like a ritual. And so Jesus is inserting himself into this commotion and putting a ritual in there to make his point. His point, of course, is it takes a little something to be able to see what the truth is, to see who he is and what God is up to. But why does it have to be mud? John the Evangelist begins his gospel story, his very unusual gospel story compared to the three others, with the words, "In the beginning." There's one other book in the Bible that begins with exactly the same words, and that's not a coincidence. When John brings us the story of Jesus Christ, he is really bringing us back to the very beginning of time, where Jesus is present with God at the moment of creation. And John's gospel in that first chapter begins with how there was light and there was darkness, and how the darkness did not understand the light. And so everything we read after that point in John's gospel is about the conflict between those people who get it, the light, and those people who cannot understand what is going on. And so this particular episode is clearly a continuation of that theme. What about the mud? In the second chapter of the book of Genesis, after we have gone through that beautiful 7-day ritual of God having created the world, that great creation story, which is very grand, it switches gears. And we get the creation story again in the second chapter, but from a completely different perspective. In the fourth verse, we see God stepping into the world that he has just created. There's a stream of living water running through it. And before there are plants and animals and everything else, God reaches down and makes some mud with the water from the living stream. And with that mud, with that clay, he creates Adam. And so he has leaned down and in this very intimate act brought forth the first human being. And then God breathes life into the nostrils of that first human being and creates human life. So Jesus, with this icky mud that he's spreading on the eyes of the blind man, is reminding everyone who is present, and us in the retelling, back to that moment when God is bringing new human life into the world with love. With such love that God has bent down and breathed that first breath into that human being. And that's the point of light in this blind man's story. And so there are people in the story who get it right away, the blind man especially. And there are people who are just too stuck in the way they've been used to doing things and don't quite get it. And I think that given that it's sort of spring, right? I work as a hospice chaplain, and I work in southwestern Iowa. And this week I stepped out of my car on a farm and felt my left foot go quite deep into something soft. And I went, right, mud. But this mud that's so present in the spring is what makes it possible for that little corn kernel to grow into a stalk as tall as me. It makes it possible for us to be fed. It makes it possible for the animals to feed. It really is at the source of what allows us to live. So today's story is literal. We need the mud. But it's also figurative. It reminds us of God's continuing loving work among us, and how Jesus is a part of that. And we, as the eyes and the hands and the ears of the resurrected Jesus in this world, are being called to remember that we are the bearers of this light, that we are the bearers of the mud, and that we are being called to do something for it in God's name. Amen.